It's really a pleasure to be here, and I love coming up to Mohawk. And I've maybe been to this particular venue 3 times, and I never remember how to get here. And I had a different kind of connectivity problem this morning. I dropped my phone into the toilet for the 2nd time in 3 weeks. And I was a little worried that I was going to need the phone to be able to get here successfully, but I managed to navigate my way through the roads and make it. So anyway, let's move on. The phone is safely tucked away in a bag, don't worry, it's not hurting anybody. So I'm here to talk a little bit about habitat connectivity from a big picture, high-level overview of connectivity issues in the Hudson Valley, but also generally connectivity issues really that much of the world faces, but specifically in the Hudson Valley, talk about why it's important for wildlife, what are the impacts of breaking up this connectivity that wildlife need, and what are the impacts of climate change on the ability for animals to move. Then talk about some of the tools that colleagues and I have worked on to map areas of importance for connectivity and some on-the-ground examples of connectivity, how to improve connectivity at the local scale. Again, it's going to be short on specifics, but that's a lot of the rest of the agenda today is about particular projects that people have worked on. Let's go. Let's be patient, she said. I just wanted to start with an overview of the importance of animal movement and migration, and this topic is a huge area of research for wildlife ecologists and animal behaviorists, and it's become of particular importance, of course, because we have drastically changed the landscape through which these animals need to move. So from the cricket frog on the upper left, which needs upland habitat. It's an aquatic breeder and spends a lot of its summer in the water, but then retreats to the uplands in the fall and spends the winter hibernating in the uplands. That wasn't really recognized early on, and so when people protected habitats for cricket frogs, they weren't necessarily thinking about connecting those habitats to the upland habitats that cricket frogs need. The scarlet tanager at the lower left is an example of a forest interior bird. And we think of birds as being able to fly wherever they want. Connectivity can't be important for birds, right? Well, that's not entirely true. And there are a lot of forest interior birds that are really reluctant to cross forest gaps. Black bears are an example of a wide-ranging mammal. They need large areas of habitat. And ideally, those habitats do not include your backyard or the shopping mall, but sometimes they do because we encroach so much on black bear habitat. The fish at the upper right are an example of species that require aquatic connectivity, and Laura touched on that with her culvert example, and I'll go into that also a little bit later, but fish passage, people talk about fish passage a lot, and fish need connected aquatic habitats to be able to access important breeding sites and to be able to maintain gene flow. On the lower right is the red eft, the terrestrial juvenile stage of the eastern spotted newt. So the newt, as you might know, is aquatic as a larva. Its juvenile stage is terrestrial, and these animals move a lot, and they move to where they return to ponds and lakes and become adults that are also aquatic. Connectivity and so animal movement and migration is an important component of thinking about connectivity. But we've broken a lot of these habitat connections. So this probably is, I think it's the second and not the last example you'll see of a suburban development and golf courses that are fragmenting natural habitats. So habitat connectivity has been broken by both roads and development in the terrestrial world, but also in the aquatic world with culverts and dams. And there are a lot of effects of these broken habitat connections. For example, challenging or difficult access to important breeding habitats. There's a spotted salamander crossing a road, moving very likely from its vernal pool, from from the upland forest to the vernal pool where it must lay its eggs and breed before returning to the uplands. And when those habitats, those upland forest habitats, are separated from their vernal pools by roads, there's a lot of mortality, and the impacts on the populations of these animals are not always well known, but certainly they can be good. There's a salmon trying to jump into a perched culvert. Well, salmon are well known for jumping up western rivers and getting to their breeding habitats, but when those breeding habitats are artificially disconnected by culverts that don't represent in any way a natural stream, it can be very challenging. There are a lot of also, I put this little life cycle of mussel, freshwater mussel up here too, to show that that has impacts on other species. And so mussels have fish hosts, and if the habitat is disconnected for those fish, then the mussels whose larvae attach to those hosts and are dispersed by them also can't connect to their habitats where they might be able to mate and, where those mussels also need to have gene flow and have resilient populations. So lots of impacts on disconnecting habitats. There's also the impacts of roads and themselves. Roads provide, are loud, and those impacts on songbirds and frog breeding are well documented in the literature. Frogs and songbirds change the pitch of their songs. They pause in their breeding calls when habitats are too noisy, and those have major impacts on the ability of some organisms to breed near roads. And there's a whole field of road ecology that documents these kinds of impacts pretty carefully. That says air and water pollution on the lower right. So roads, as we all know, have from road salt and other runoff can cause pollution to nearby aquatic and terrestrial habitats. Finally, if you're not careful, you might get handled by a citizen scientist if you happen on a road, and so you got to be really careful. But I'll tease Laura here. Laura got a sneak preview of these slides last week, and without a script, because I don't write a script. Clearly, I don't write a script. It's obvious from the way I'm stumbling over a few words, but I don't write a script. So there's a picture, and she says, "Oh my God, is he worried about citizen scientists handling amphibians? Oh gosh, maybe we better get our story straight before." No, it's just a joke, Laura. I promise. And then she said, "Oh right, it's Matt's talk. It's a joke." So those are some effects on individual animals. We've talked about roadkill is a primary one, but there's also impacts then at the population and community levels for a lot of these species. This diagram I liked because it shows that there's interior forest. If you look on the left, interior forest and animals that rely on interior forest, and then there's a whole suite of species that are more edge species. They're ones that thrive in this ecotones between forest and more open habitats. Well, when habitats are fragmented, and they don't show the fragmenting featured here, but let's say it's a large road or maybe a development, there's much more edge habitat and much less interior forest. So that changes the composition, potentially changes the composition of species within those habitat patches. So edge interior habitat and species decrease, edge habitat and species increase. Beyond that, there might be no ability for animals to move between those patches, depending on the fragmenting feature. And if there's no ability to move, then there's no gene flow. And when there's no gene flow, there can be inbreeding depression. And inbreeding depression is not about three-headed fish or animals with really funky facial features. Or it's about population level effects of inbreeding, and that's reduced gene flow over time, as is documented by inlanding turtles elsewhere in their range, and other species in the Hudson Valley are susceptible to this. If the biodiversity impacts of broken habitat connections and loss of connectivity are not compelling to a particular audience, you can always make the argument that there are dangers to people from these broken habitat connections too. One of them is backyard visitors that you might not want. Another is roadkill, but there are dangers to people of interactions with animals on highways too, right? So that car was hit by a moose, or that moose was hit by a car, and they can do a tremendous amount of damage. I've heard lots of stories of moose walking away from an accident like that, but the vehicle was crushed. So despite climate change being a hoax, somehow it's managed to ruin everything anyway. And the point of this slide is that even if we do all we can to mitigate climate change into the future, to some degree, we are already locked into a pattern where we are going to see climates a lot more like the Southeast, a lot more like South Carolina within most of our lifetimes. And that has huge impacts on the way animals need to move, how much they need to move, and we'll talk about that a little bit more now. This is an example of one of the first documented examples of the effects of warming on an animal's range. This was in Scandinavia, showing a butterfly that had shifted its range north. And this is a paper from about 20 years ago. But it's not just restricted to Scandinavia, clearly. We've seen this within New York. Within New York as well. So we have the luxury in New York State to have had 2 breeding bird atlases. We're actually gearing up for the 3rd one now. And the first one was from 1980 to 1995. So if you're familiar with breeding bird atlas, it's citizen scientists all around New York State documenting the presence and absence of breeding birds within 5,000 blocks of New York State. And so that was done again in 2000 to 2005. And researchers were able to use the data from those 2 to show that there were major shifts in breeding bird distributions within New York too. So this is not a phenomenon that's restricted to polar regions or tropical regions, but it's happening here in New York too. So I couldn't do better than this quote, which is a bit old now, maybe 7 or 8 years old, but why connectivity is more important even while climate is changing. Well-connected landscapes promote dispersal and gene flow, processes that will maximize species' abilities to respond to the stress of climate change. Furthermore, highly permeable landscapes will be important as species shift their ranges to track changes in climate and vegetation patterns. So it's worth thinking about which animals are likely to be most susceptible to these impacts and are most maybe in need of connectivity help. Well, there are some animals that will be able to move pretty well on their own without any help from us, like the golden eagle, if you're not including wind farms in your calculus there. There are other groups of animals that might be able to move to favorable habitats and climates with some help via work on habitat. And so that's a marble salamander as an example of a sort of mid-level species like that. And then there's some species that might need to be translocated from their current habitat to future habitats, and those are ones that are the poorest of dispersers. So really in this conversation, I think we're talking mostly about that middle group, the ones that we can do work on connecting and conserving habitats to help them with this transition as the climate warms and changes. So how do we know where to work? That's a question that some of us can struggle with a little bit, because if we work at large spatial scales, we work in the Hudson Valley, say, or in my case, all of New York State, and how do we decide where to work? Well, if our landscape looked like this is Kansas, I think. If our landscape looked like this, and we were worried about connectivity, well, the kind of habitat we would need to reconnect would be pretty obvious because it's one kind of habitat. But we work and live in the Hudson Valley, right? And this is a complex landscape with several naturally fragmenting features, like the river itself, like some of the mountain ranges, and then throw on top of that some of these anthropogenic fragmenting features like roads and developments. And it becomes a very complex question. So I put on this slide 3 ways that how we know how to reconnect. What's funny? Oh, sorry. Oh, that's the wrong slide. I'm That's embarrassing. We can look at landscapes and we can sit around a table and look at maps and say, these are the places that need to be reconnected. And we know this from our own personal experience. We know this from being able to interpret aerial photography and habitat maps. And so often this is an approach, this expert opinion approach, can really give you a good idea of where you need to work in a particular landscape. Other times it takes field research. You want to know where the animals are crossing, and that can be done by looking at tracks or installing wildlife cameras to document movements of animals in particular pinch points. And then there's computer modeling, which you can do at these large landscape scales. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that more because it's so exciting, and because I've dabbled in that a little bit, and I can give you some examples from my own experience. So this was a project that, with assistance and support from both the state DEC, the State Wildlife Grants Program, and the Hudson River Estuary Program, colleague and I, Tim Howard, worked on at the Natural Heritage Program. We called it Pathways. It was actually an acronym that stood for something that I don't bother trying to spell out. But it was a project on wildlife habitat connectivity as the climate changes within the Hudson Valley. And the way we built these models was to take 26 species of greatest conservation need. So these are species that the state had identified as of needing some conservation help. And to model their distributions in New York and model connectivity between those. This is all based on land cover and climate and geology and some other factors that go into these kind of distribution models. And then change the climate in our models and see what we expect will happen when the climate changes. So what I'm showing you now is a map of, in the current day, which was, I guess was 2012 then, but probably applies pretty well now in 2017. The darker red you get, that's the more species that were predicted to have suitable habitat in those parcels. These are all ownership parcels. We thought that was a good way to sort of roll up our data because that's where a lot of conservation decisions are made, or at the parcel level. So the redder it is, the more important it was for some of these 26 species. And then, like I said, we changed the climate. And you can watch as the importance of these habitats generally moves up and northward. So there's 2050, that's our prediction. Look at the gunks and catskills getting more important for these species. Some of the species included are on the cover of that document. So there's a Blanding's turtle, there's a long-tailed salamander, box turtle, New England cottontail, timber rattlesnake, and some insects like gray petal-tailed dragonfly. And then 2080, look how important the Catskills has become for some of these organisms that need to track climate as it moves, as it gets warmer and in some cases wetter. But look how the Hudson Highlands still remains a pretty important spot. So I'm going to go back again just to let you watch that transition one more time. And look at some of the really key places like this Shawangum Ridge to Catskills connection really stands out as an important place for wildlife to be able to move. And so for us to be able to work to connect these habitats and make sure they're well enough connected that not just these rare species, but even common species that are wide-ranging, especially might need to move from one area of habitat to another. There are lots of other mapping tools out there. I'm going to run through some of them very quickly. I don't know the details of them very well necessarily, but I wanted to give you an overview of the kinds of other mapping tools that are available. This was some work following up on our Pathways work that Jenna Hickey led for the Hudson River Estuary Program and Cornell. And so she, rather than using individual species to model connectivity, she used habitats and looked at the habitat level, how would you connect forest blocks? And how would you connect wetlands to one another? You're going to hear more about this later from Scenic Hudson. This is the Hudson Valley Conservation Strategy, and they included a connectivity model in that, and I'm looking forward to hearing about that as well. They seem to include some other county there off the left that's like Oneida or Niagara or something, I forget which one. And I wanted to highlight this tool that colleagues at the Nature Conservancy developed. So this is called the Natural Resource Navigator. We contributed some modeling and data to this project, and it has just a tremendous amount of information for making decisions about conservation in a changing climate. And so I've bulleted several of the ways you can approach conservation planning using the Natural Resource Navigator. You can evaluate an existing project to see if it makes sense anymore, given that the climate is changing. You can develop climate-smart conservation strategies for a particular area that you work in. Thank you. You can find places to pursue a particular strategy that you're interested in, or you can decide what species to focus on or what to do if you care about a particular species and you want to make sure it can persist in this landscape. Here's an example from the Staying Connected initiative that Laura mentioned that is an example of local scale connectivity that also, so those kinds of resources are also available. This is connecting the Hudson Highlands to the Green Mountains. And I think this is the last map. This is a work that the Nature Conservancy did in conjunction with the Department of Transportation, and we also contributed some models to this, showing the priority culverts for connecting aquatic habitats all around New York State. And this can be scaled down too, so if you're working in a particular area, you could look at the priority culverts in your area. Is that a question?
This is done prior to all the culvert mapping that is being done right now.
That's right. So this was a model of priority culverts, and then I think a follow-up from this has been, well, I don't know how connected the two initiatives you're talking about are, but there's been a lot of work now to map individual culverts and recognize, which are the problem culverts. And so this was more, again, because it's statewide. Where are the priority culverts? If you're with the DOT and you have culvert money, where should you spend that culvert money? And then you look and say, where are the problem culverts within those conservative priority areas? I just have a couple of minutes and I'm supposed to leave time for questions. So how can we facilitate increased connectivity? You'll hear more examples about this later. Aquatic connectivity can be facilitated, of course, by turning these problem culverts into, when possible, bridges or even or new culverts that more mimic stream conditions. And in the terrestrial landscape, wildlife overpasses are popular now in Europe and in the West. At least they're gaining a lot of traction, and I'd love to see those reconnecting habitats on either side of the New York Thruway. There are small-scale versions of that. That's on the right. These are wildlife tunnels underneath highways and roads, and good signage that says, "Look out! There's salamanders going to be crossing this road every April. You better watch out." That's all I have. Thank you. I have 10 minutes. 7 minutes.